Karen Whitmore loved control. It wasn't just about running the HOA. It was about owning the neighborhood, shaping every single house, street, and front yard into her perfect vision of order. For years, she had managed to bend the residents of Oakwood Court to her will, making sure they understood who was in charge. She had dictated what colors houses could be painted, banned lawn ornaments, and regulated the exact shades of flowers people could plant. If something disrupted the aesthetic of the neighborhood, Karen made sure it was handled immediately. But her newest crusade? Outdoor food consumption. To Karen, the sight of people eating outside was disgusting. It was filthy, improper, and an invitation for pests. The idea of kids dripping sticky popsicle juice onto the sidewalk or residents lounging on their porches with greasy fast food bags in hand made her blood boil. It started as a passive-aggressive complaint in an HOA meeting. "Does anyone else feel like this community has become unruly?" she had asked, voice dripping with fake concern. "I've been noticing people eating on their lawns, on their driveways, even on their porches. It's really bringing down the neighborhood's prestige." A few of the board members had nodded absently, but most just shrugged it off. Karen wasn't satisfied. She needed a rule. That night, she sat at her desk, meticulously crafting a new HOA ordinance. She titled it, Community Cleanliness and Respect Policy. And in bold, she wrote, "Food consumption outside of designated indoor areas is strictly prohibited in Oakwood Court." The next morning, the flyers went up all over the neighborhood. No eating outside. No exceptions. Karen watched from her window, expecting immediate compliance. But nothing happened. People still ate on their porches, children still ran down the sidewalk with ice cream cones and juice boxes, and nobody took her new rule seriously. Karen was furious. She started patrolling the streets, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who dared to eat outside. She took photos, sent angry emails, and even knocked on doors, issuing stern reminders about the new regulation. But no one was listening. Until one afternoon, when she saw it. A little boy, 6 years old, blonde hair, big innocent eyes, happily licking an ice cream cone as he stood in his front yard. Karen stiffened. The boy was Liam Parker, the son of Jessica and Daniel Parker, a family that had moved in a year ago. They had already challenged her on landscaping rules, pushed back against mailbox restrictions, and ignored her demand to remove wind chimes from their porch. And now, they were letting their son eat ice cream right in front of their house. It was a direct challenge. Karen marched across the street, eyes locked onto the child, like predators spotting prey. As she got closer, Liam looked up, his little face lighting up in excitement. "Hi, lady," he said, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. Karen's lips curled in disgust as she pointed at the melting ice cream. "You can't eat that outside," she snapped. Liam blinked, confused. He looked around as if expecting someone to explain the rule to him. Karen didn't wait. Before the boy could react, she snatched the cone right out of his hands. Liam let out a small gasp, his eyes wide with shock. Karen threw the ice cream onto the ground, letting it splatter against the pavement. "No food outside," she barked. "That is the rule, and you need to learn it." For a second, there was silence. Then, Liam's eyes filled with tears. His lower lip trembled, his little hands clenching into fists at his sides. And then, he started sobbing. Loud, heartbreaking cries that immediately shattered the peaceful afternoon. Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, stop that ridiculous noise." But before she could say anything else, the front door of the Parker house flew open. Jessica Parker came storming outside, her expression a mix of confusion and absolute fury. "What the hell is going on?" Liam ran straight to his mother, sobbing into her legs, pointing at Karen. She threw my ice cream," he wailed. "She said no food outside." Jessica's eyes snapped toward Karen, her face darkening. Karen folded her arms, standing her ground. "I'm enforcing HOA policy." Jessica's nostrils flared. "Are you out of your damn mind? You took ice cream from a child." Karen lifted her chin. "I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." Jessica let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You literally just said you made the policy." By now, neighbors were stepping outside, drawn by the commotion. People were whispering, frowning, some already pulling out their phones. Karen could feel the scrutiny, the weight of so many eyes on her. But she wasn't backing down. "This is about standards," she said firmly, looking around as if expecting the crowd to agree. If we allow food outside, soon we'll have pests, rodents, garbage everywhere. This is about preserving the integrity of our community. Someone in the crowd, Mark Reynolds, a longtime resident who had never liked Karen, let out a bitter chuckle. Integrity, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. Karen, you just ripped ice cream out of a 6-year-old's hands. You sound like a psychopath. A ripple of agreement spread through the gathering crowd. Karen felt her control slipping. Her rule was being questioned. Her power was being undermined. And worst of all, people were recording. Jessica bent down, wiping Liam's tears, her voice shaking with anger. You owe my son an apology. Karen snorted. I owe him nothing. Maybe next time you should teach your child to respect rules. Jessica's face turned red with fury. You have an O, right? But before she could finish, Mark Reynolds cut in loudly, holding up his phone. Oh, she's going to regret this, he muttered, filming the entire scene. Karen felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just a small argument anymore. This was turning into something bigger. Something she couldn't control. And she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Karen could feel the balance of power shifting, slipping through her fingers like sand. The weight of the neighborhood's scrutiny bore down on her, the whispers growing louder, the cameras still recording. She had never faced this much defiance all at once, and for the first time in years, she didn't know how to stop it. Jessica stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted with pure disgust as she looked at Karen like she was something rotten on the bottom of her shoe. Liam, still sniffling beside her, gripped his mother's leg, glaring at Karen with a mix of fear and anger only a child could manage. Karen had expected obedience. She had expected the Parkers to back down like so many others had before them, to accept the fine, the warning, the absolute authority of the HOA. But Jessica wasn't backing down, and neither was the rest of the neighborhood. Karen straightened her spine, ignoring the way her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had to regain control. Let me remind you all, she said, voice dripping with forced authority, that I'm simply upholding the rules of this community. If you can't follow them, then perhaps you don't belong here. A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of anger that made Karen's stomach twist uncomfortably. Mark Reynolds let out a loud, bitter laugh. Shaking his head as he pointed his phone right at her face. That's rich, he said. You just told a 6-year-old he doesn't belong here. Do you even hear yourself? Karen's face burned red. That's not what I meant. Mark raised an eyebrow. Oh, because that's what it sounded like. Karen turned toward Jessica, seizing the opportunity to redirect the conversation. This isn't personal, she said, her voice tight and clipped. It's about the rules. And if you refuse to comply, you'll continue to be fined. End of story. Jessica's eyes flashed with fury. Oh, Karen, she said, voice low and dangerously calm. This is far from over. Karen's stomach clenched at the way she said it. Jessica turned toward the crowd again, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. Anyone else sick of this? She called. A chorus of murmurs and nods rippled through the group. Someone in the back shouted, She's been doing this for years. Karen felt a wave of unease roll over her. Jessica turned back to her, smiling coldly. Looks like you've got more than just me to deal with now. Karen forced herself to keep her expression blank, but inside, she was boiling with rage. She would not be challenged like this. Not by Jessica Parker. Not by anyone. If you want to appeal the fine, she said, voice sharp, you know the process. But Jessica just grinned wider. Oh, I'm not appealing anything, she said, tilting her head. I'm going to fight back. Karen blinked. Excuse me? Jessica stepped closer, her voice lowering to something only Karen could hear. I'm done playing by your rules, she said. And I think the rest of the neighborhood is too. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Jessica stepped back, raising her voice so the entire crowd could hear. Who's in favor of filing a formal complaint against Karen? Nearly every hand in the crowd shot up. Karen's stomach twisted into knots. Jessica turned back to her, arms folded. There it is. A majority. You love rules, Karen. Let's see how you like this one. Karen could barely process what was happening. The crowd was against her. Her authority was crumbling before her eyes. And for the first time in her reign as HOA president, she didn't know what to do. Karen could feel the air shift, the neighborhood's collective anger crystallizing into something more than just whispers and frustration. This wasn't just another disagreement over HOA rules. This was an uprising, and she was standing at the center of it, watching the walls close in around her. Jessica Parker stood tall, arms crossed, her entire posture exuding defiance. The crowd, once hesitant and fragmented, was now united in its rage. This wasn't just about an ice cream cone anymore. This was about years of Karen's unchecked power, her bullying, her suffocating rules. And the worst part, Karen had no way out. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding the rulebook. Jessica turned toward the crowd, her voice loud and clear. "I don't know about the rest of you," she called, "but I'm done letting her decide what we can and can't do in our own damn neighborhood." A chorus of agreement rippled through the gathering. Who's had fines for things that aren't even in the bylaws? More hands shot up. Who's gotten a letter over something stupid? Even more. And who's had enough of Karen's power trips? Nearly every single person raised a hand. Karen felt her stomach drop. This was a nightmare. She couldn't let this happen. She had spent years cultivating her authority, bending the HOA board to her will, making sure that when she spoke, people obeyed. And now, they were turning against her. Her eyes darted toward Mark Reynolds, still filming, his phone raised like a weapon. "This is harassment," Karen snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at Jessica. "You're instigating a revolt against the HOA. That's illegal." Jessica scoffed. "No, Karen. What's illegal is what you've been doing for years." Karen felt a flicker of unease creep up her spine. Jessica took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough so only Karen could hear. "We know about the fake fines," she said. Karen's breath hitched. "We know about the anonymous complaints you wrote yourself." The blood in Karen's veins turned ice cold. Jessica smirked. "You really thought no one would figure it out?" Karen tried to mask her panic, but the smugness in Jessica's face told her everything she needed to know. They had evidence. Jessica turned back toward the crowd, voice rising again. "We're filing a formal complaint against Karen for abuse of power," she declared. "Every bogus fine, every intimidation tactic, every time she's used this HOA as her personal dictatorship, it ends today." Karen's hands began to shake. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. You can't do that. I am the HOA." Jessica let out a short, mocking laugh. "No, Karen," she said, tilting her head. "You're just a woman with a clipboard." The crowd erupted into murmurs, some laughing, others openly agreeing. Karen's face burned red, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. "This is slander," she shrieked. This is a conspiracy." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Karen spun around, looking for an ally, someone, anyone who would stand up for her. But no one did. Even the few residents who had once sided with her, who had nodded along with her endless rules and regulations, now stood in silent disapproval. She was alone. For the first time since she took power, Karen had lost the neighborhood. And Jessica knew it. Karen's breath came in short, shallow bursts, panic setting in like a vice around her throat. She had to stop this. She had to regain control. If they overthrew her, if they removed her from the HOA board, she would lose everything. Her power, her control, her identity. "I won't allow this," she hissed. Jessica grinned. "It's not up to you." The crowd began to move, splitting into small groups, murmuring about gathering complaints, organizing signatures, making it official. Karen could feel it happening in real time, the ground shifting beneath her feet, her empire crumbling around her. Jessica leaned in one last time, voice soft, but razor sharp. "You can't find your way out of this one, Karen." And with that, she turned her back on her. Karen was still standing in the street, still frozen in disbelief, as her neighborhood, began a process of dismantling her rule, one complaint at a time. Karen's world was collapsing around her, and she had no idea how to stop it. For years, she had ruled Oakwood Court with an iron fist, issuing fines, citations, and HOA violations with zero opposition. She had weaponized the bylaws to suit her needs, manipulating rules and inventing new ones just to keep people in line. But now, the very system she had built to control the neighborhood was being turned against her. Jessica Parker wasn't just angry, she was organizing. The murmuring crowd had quickly evolved into a movement, neighbors forming small groups, talking in hushed, determined voices. Some had already pulled out their phones, drafting formal complaints against Karen, referencing years of bogus fines, fabricated citations, and harassment. Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to stop this before it spiraled completely out of control. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward, her voice booming over the chatter. "This is completely inappropriate," she snapped. "You cannot simply band together and overthrow a governing body." Jessica turned, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Oh, you mean like how you've been governing us for years? Dictating everything we do? Handing out fines like Halloween candy?" Karen's jaw clenched. "I have been maintaining order," she said through gritted teeth. "Without structure, this community would fall into absolute chaos." Mark Reynolds let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head as he continued filming. "Oh, come on, Karen," he said. "You really think people having a damn ice cream cone outside is chaos?" The crowd muttered in agreement, and Karen felt her throat tighten. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spent years conditioning these people to fall in line, to fear the HOA's authority. Yet now, they were laughing at her. Jessica folded her arms, tilting her head. "You know what's funny, Karen?" Karen refused to answer. Jessica smirked anyway. "For someone who loves rules so much, you sure seem terrified when we use them against you." Karen's stomach twisted. The neighbors weren't just filing complaints. They were gathering signatures. A petition. She could see it, passing from person to person, people eagerly scrawling their names onto the paper. Some of them even looked relieved, like they had been waiting for this moment for years. She knew how HOA removals worked. If enough residents signed the complaint, they could force an emergency vote to remove her from the HOA board altogether. And if they removed her from the board, she would have nothing left. Her fingers curled into fists. She had to find a way out of this. Karen scanned the crowd, looking for someone, anyone who would still back her up. She spotted Brenda Holloway, a longtime supporter who had always followed HOA rules to the letter. Brenda had been one of Karen's closest allies, someone who believed in maintaining order, keeping the neighborhood pristine and respectable. If she could just get her on her side, maybe she could still turn this around. She strode toward Brenda, forcing a tight, controlled smile. "Brenda," she said sweetly, "surely you don't agree with this nonsense?" Brenda shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the petition in her hands. Karen's stomach dropped. Brenda had already signed it. Karen's fingers dug into her palms. You're siding with them," she hissed. Brenda let out a slow sigh. "Karen, I supported you for a long time, but—" She gestured toward the crowd, the angry neighbors, the filming phones, the petition spreading like wildfire. "You went too far, and I can't stand by you anymore." Karen felt like she had been punched in the gut. Jessica stepped beside Brenda, smirking. "Looks like you're out of allies, Karen." Karen's breath hitched. No, she was not going down like this. She had one last card to play. If she could stall them, find a way to delay the signatures long enough, she could still weasel her way out of this. She forced herself to calm down, took a deep breath, and turned toward the crowd, hands raised in a mock display of patience. "I understand that emotions are high right now," she said smoothly. "So let's do this the proper way. Let's schedule a community meeting and discuss this rationally." Jessica let out a sharp laugh. "No, Karen. We're doing this now." Karen's blood ran cold. Jessica turned toward Mark. "How many signatures do we need to call an emergency meeting?" Mark checked his phone, then grinned. 30% of the neighborhood needs to sign the petition." Jessica turned toward the crowd. "How many do we have so far?" Brenda flipped through the pages, then smiled. 40%. Karen's knees nearly buckled. It was done. They had the signatures. Jessica turned back to her, eyes flashing with victory. "We'll be seeing you at the HOA emergency meeting tomorrow night," she said. And Karen's breath shuddered. Jessica grinned. "Pack up your clipboard. You're done." Karen spent the entire night pacing, her mind racing in circles, searching for a way, to regain control before the emergency HOA meeting. She couldn't afford to lose this fight. This wasn't just about the HOA. It was about power, about respect, about keeping the neighborhood in line. For years, she had ruled without question, and now these ungrateful, disobedient people thought they could overthrow her? No, she wouldn't allow it. She had to find a way to stop the vote. At 4 a.m., after hours of scribbling plans, drafting arguments, and rehearsing counterattacks in her mirror, she came up with a last-ditch effort. If she could prove that Jessica Parker had been instigating hostility against the HOA, she could argue that the petition was invalid. That was an act of neighborhood sabotage rather than an official request. She just needed proof. Karen rummaged through her files, pulling out every complaint, every fine, every email she had ever written about the Parkers. She even combed through the HOA security footage, looking for anything at all that she could use against Jessica. But the more she searched, the more she realized the truth. There was nothing she could use. Nothing that would justify tearing ice cream from a child's hands, fabricating fines, or sending bogus violations. For the first time in her life, Karen had nothing to back herself up. And that terrified her. But she wasn't out of options yet. If she couldn't discredit Jessica, she would have to control the meeting itself. The next day, she arrived at the Oakwood Court Community Center an hour early, marching inside with her binder full of regulations, her clipboard, and her most practiced look of authority. If she could run the meeting on her terms, maybe she could still intimidate people into backing down. She set up the seating strategically, making sure her allies, the few she had left, were spread around the room, their presence giving the illusion that she still had support. But when the doors opened, she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. The room flooded with people. Not just the usual attendees, everyone. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting before. Parents with their kids. Elderly couples who had long stayed neutral, but were now shaking their heads in disapproval. And worst of all, nearly everyone had their phones out, recording. Karen's throat tightened. This wasn't going to be a private discussion. This was a trial. Jessica Parker walked in last, carrying a folder thicker than Karen's own binder. She gave Karen a mocking little smile, then took her seat. Karen forced herself to stay composed, rapping her knuckles on the table to quiet the crowd. "All right, let's begin," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "We are here tonight to address a petition that has been circulated in direct opposition to HOA governance." Jessica leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You mean your governance?" Karen ignored her. "As HOA president, it is my duty to uphold order and fairness. And quite frankly, I believe this entire petition is nothing more than an attempted coup fueled by personal grievances rather than legitimate community concerns." Jessica let out a laugh, a real amused laugh. "Oh, Karen," she said, "let's cut the theatrics. No one is here because of a coup." She flipped open her folder, pulling out a thick stack of complaints. "We're here because of you." Karen's heart skipped a beat. Jessica held up documents for everyone to see. "These," she said, "are copies of every bogus fine you've ever written." Karen's jaw locked. Jessica pulled out another stack of papers. "These are emails you sent to residents, emails that aren't legally enforceable, but were worded to make people think they were." Karen's pulse pounded. Jessica slapped a final document onto the table. "And this," she said, tapping the page. "This is a legal demand letter from a real estate lawyer, confirming that you've been issuing fines that aren't even in the HOA bylaws." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen could feel it. The shift. The undeniable truth laid bare for everyone to see. But she refused to go down quietly. "These are lies," she hissed. "Baseless accusations meant to." "Actually," Jessica cut in, flipping over another page, "here's a signed affidavit from a former HOA board member stating that you personally altered community policies without proper approval." Karen stopped breathing. Jessica turned toward the room. "Show of hands. Who here has received a fine from Karen that seemed unfair?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. Karen's chest tightened. Jessica leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "That's why we're here, Karen. Not because of a coup, not because of personal grievances, but because you abused your power for years, and now," she smirked, "you finally have to answer for it." Karen's vision blurred at the edges. This was slipping away from her. She opened her mouth, ready to fight, ready to spin a counter-argument. But then Mark Reynolds stood up, phone still recording. "I think we've heard enough," he said. He turned to the rest of the room. "Who here votes to remove Karen Whitmore from the HOA board effective immediately?" A wave of hands shot up. Karen felt her stomach drop through the floor. Mark glanced around the room, then nodded. "Well then," he said, "looks like it's unanimous." Karen froze. No, this couldn't be happening. She had spent years building her power, enforcing order, making sure people listened to her. And now, with a single vote, she was nothing. Jessica stood, picking up her folder of evidence with a satisfied smile. Enjoy retirement, Karen. Karen gripped the table, her nails digging into the wood, her face burning with humiliation and rage. The room erupted into murmurs, neighbors filing out, talking amongst themselves. Not about her, not anymore. They were moving on. She wasn't part of the conversation anymore. She had been erased. As she sat there, completely paralyzed by the reality of her downfall, she saw Liam Parker skip past her, happily licking an ice cream cone. Jessica leaned down beside him, whispering something with a grin. And for the first time in her miserable reign as HOA president, Karen felt powerless. Because she was. Karen sat in stunned silence, her hands gripping the edge of the table, so tightly her knuckles turned white. The voices around her were nothing but a muffled blur, a distant hum of conversations she was no longer a part of. It was over. The vote had passed. She was no longer HOA president. For the first time in a decade, Karen Whitmore had no power. The room continued to empty, people filing out in small clusters, their excitement palpable. The very same neighbors who once cowered under her rules, who feared her fines and her clipboard, were now laughing, hugging, celebrating. They had won, and they knew it. Karen forced herself to breathe, her vision swimming, her entire body locked in place as she tried to process what had just happened. How had this happened? How had she lost everything? Her fingers dug into the wooden table, her nails scraping against the polished surface. She could feel the burning humiliation rising up her throat, the sting of defeat sinking deep into her chest like a knife. Jessica Parker had done this to her. That arrogant, insufferable woman had turned the entire neighborhood against her. She had taken everything. And she was still smiling. Karen looked up just in time to see Jessica standing near the door, speaking with Mark Reynolds and a few others. Liam Parker stood beside her, his face sticky with ice cream, his little eyes bright with happiness as he waved at a friend across the room. The sight of that damn ice cream cone made Karen's blood boil all over again. It should have been a simple rule, a minor adjustment to community standards. But instead, it had destroyed her. Karen inhaled sharply, trying to push down the overwhelming wave of fury that threatened to consume her whole. No, she refused to let this be the end of her story. She had one last move left to play. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself up from her chair, smoothing the front of her blazer with practiced precision. She could feel people watching her, expecting her to explode, to lash out, to make some last desperate grasp at control. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, she turned, striding toward the exit with the last shred of dignity she had left. Jessica caught sight of her, raising an eyebrow. Leaving so soon? Karen stopped, turning just enough to look at her. You may have won this round, she said, her voice calm, measured, dangerously smooth. Jessica smirked. Karen, this wasn't a game. You lost. For good. Karen didn't flinch. We'll see. She turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking against the polished floors, her breath steady despite the raging fire inside her. She needed a new plan. The HOA might have been stolen from her, but she still had connections. There were still loopholes, legal angles, ways to fight back. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, and she wasn't about to fade into obscurity without a fight. If they thought they had seen the last of Karen Whitmore, they were sorely mistaken. Because revenge, after all, was best served cold. And she had nothing but time. Then,